Well, hello and welcome to this English lesson about the news. People are curious. We want to know what's going on in the world. We want to know what's going on in our town or city. We like to hear what people are doing. So the news is something that has been around for a very long time. I myself like to read the local newspaper. I like to read Google News. I like to listen to the news on the radio when I'm driving to work. So I certainly like the news, and I'm sure many of you do as well. So in this English lesson, I'll teach you some words and phrases that you'll need to know to be able to talk about the news if you're having a conversation about it. So once again, welcome to this English lesson about the news. So if you like the news, you probably have a preferred news source. Your news source is the place where you get your news from. And we do use the verb get to talk about news. Where do you get your news from? I like to watch TV news. I like the newspaper. I like radio, or I like the internet. And when we talk about internet, we also might be talking about a news app. You might have a news app on your phone that you use to get the news. So your news source would be the place where you get your news from. For me, it used to be the TV. That used to be the news source that I preferred, but I have not watched TV news for a couple years. I usually get my news from the internet now, which might not be the most reliable place to get news from, but I do like opening up Google News and I will read that. I also will listen to the news on the radio, and at school, we still get a newspaper. So I will still read some parts of the newspaper. I don't read the whole newspaper, but so my main source would be the internet, and then radio and newspaper would be the next two sources where I get my news from to see what's happening in the world around me. And then here we go. So we have TV news. When someone refers to news, they often say where they got it from. So they'll say, oh, I like to watch TV news. That would be the way I would describe it. This is a pretty old picture, by the way. I think the presidents have changed a couple of times in the United States since then. And then you will also have what are called news networks. So as we talk about TV news, I'll give you some words and phrases to be able to talk about that. A news network would be something like the BBC. That's probably a very familiar network to many of you around the world. By the way, the BBC doesn't just have news, they also help people learn English. So if you ever do a search for BBC Learning English, you'll find some. In Canada, by the way, CNN is an American news network. In Canada, we have something called the CBC. The CBC News would be the news network. I don't mind watching the CBC. That's the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, if you're wondering. It's similar to the BBC. You know, Canada and Britain, it's kind of similar sometimes. So we have CBC, they have BBC. Someone who goes on camera to tell you about the news is called a reporter, or we might call them a TV journalist. So a couple different names there, but you'll see this person is out probably covering a story. That's how we would refer to that. Something's probably happening in this location. And so the reporter is there and they are telling the story. They are reporting on the news. So either reporter or TV journalist. When you see people sitting at a desk when you're watching TV news, we usually call them an anchor. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two. We would call these people news anchors. I'm not sure why. If you know, an anchor is actually something that you put in the water to stop a boat from moving. But we also use this word to talk about someone who is kind of the main person, the news anchor for that TV station's news show. We would call them a news anchor or just anchor. So, and I think there's a funny movie called Anchorman. I think that's the name of it, with Will Ferrell. I can't recommend it. I'm not sure if you're into that kind of humor. It's pretty strange, but it is based on a funny, humorous look at the world of news. So often there will be something happening in the world and a news network will send a journalist or reporter to that area. And then we usually call that person a correspondent. So if someone is covering something that's happening in the world, maybe there's a natural disaster, maybe there's a tsunami, they might send a news correspondent. That's someone who moves to that country temporarily to report on what's happening there. So we have war correspondents who report on war. You might have just a correspondent reporting on a natural disaster or something interesting that's happening in that country. So it's still just a reporter or TV journalist, but we would also call them a correspondent, someone who, if you know the verb corresponds, like they send information to you. We also have the person who operates the camera. Back here, we had a person in the foreground. There's a new word for you maybe, operating the camera. And we call that person a camera operator, a camera person, maybe cameraman or camera woman. But in my research, I think the most common term right now is camera person or camera operator. A person who knows how to use a very expensive camera to create really good images of the reporter who is reporting on the news. I've used the verb to cover a few times as well. I don't have that in my list, but a camera operator and camera person and TV journalists will go to cover the news. They'll go to report on the news to let all of us know what is happening. So when you refer to what they're talking about, we usually call it a news story or a segment or a report. So the anchor might say, let's go to our correspondent Joe in Italy. He's going to report on the beautiful weather that's happening right now. And it will be a news story about beautiful weather in Italy. It will be a news segment about the beautiful weather or a report. They're kind of interchangeable. A report is usually a little more serious. A story or segment just talks about one thing for a bit. But you would hear all of these terms when you are watching TV news. You might say, okay, or you might hear the anchor say, we're going to go now to a report from Joe, or we're going to update you in the next segment about the weather in Canada, or here's a news story about how everyone should come and visit Canada someday. I don't know if there's news stories like that. And then the place where the anchor works, and we would also call these people reporters or TV journalists, is usually called the newsroom or the studio. Both names work. Often they will work in the newsroom. There will be people out in the field. That's interesting. I don't have that term in the list either. When you're out in the field, it means you're reporting from downtown, or you've gone to a factory or somewhere where there is something that needs to be talked about. But the people in the actual news area, we would call that the newsroom or the studio. And then you'll even sometimes hear them say that someone is on location. So maybe there's a protest. I'm not sure what this is a protest of, but it's possible that there's a protest somewhere. And so a news reporter will go with the camera person, and they'll be on location. They'll go to the place where whatever is happening is happening. And we then say they're on location. So they go out to where the news is happening, and they report on the news while they're on location. And we would call that a news crew. So I'll tell you a little story. I saw a news crew a couple weeks ago, and that's what made me remember to do this lesson. We have speed cameras in the town where I work, and someone in the night came and chopped the speed camera down and threw it in the ditch. And the next morning there was a news crew there. So a news crew would be the reporter, the TV journalist, the camera person. It looks like they have an audio technician with as well. But someone in the night was very angry that we have speed cameras. And so they came with a tool and they chopped it down. And so the next day there was a news crew there on location, covering the story, reporting on what had happened there. Hopefully you heard all the terms I just used there. News crew was on location, reporting on the story, covering the story, and letting people know what was happening there. And then they came in a van. They came in a news van. So parked a little further away, actually in our parking lot, there was a van. I should have taken a picture of the actual van. This is probably a van in America somewhere. But a news van is the vehicle that a news crew will use to get to the location. It might have special antennas or a satellite dish, so that as they're telling the story, they can do it live. So they can talk to the anchors in the studio from the place where they are. Sometimes a news crew will just come and record a story, and then they'll edit it on a computer to show later. But sometimes they'll be live. So they'll actually be reporting the news as it happens. And they come in a news van with all of the technology that they would need in order to report on what is going on. Sometimes when there is a reporter or TV journalist talking about something on location, when they're done, they'll say, and now back to the studio, or now back to you. And what they mean is the scene is going to switch from their camera person, what their camera person is showing, back to the shot in the studio. So if I was a TV journalist, I would be out there with my microphone and my camera person, and I would report on the story. And at the end, I would say, that's all for me, Joe, back to the studio, or back to you in the studio. So it simply means that the story that is being reported on live is over, and they are going to switch from showing what's happening where you are to what's happening in the studio. Okay, enough about TV news. Let's talk about the newspaper. This is an older picture of me. I think I'm thinner. I don't know. Maybe a little bit. Maybe if I saw, I don't know. Enough about me. The newspaper. This is probably one of the earliest forms of news that we created on this planet. A newspaper is, of course, a paper news source that you can buy at a bookstore, at a I was going to say magasin. I'm not speaking French today. Quincaillerie. In Quebec, they have different names. Anyways, at a corner store, you can buy it at a newsstand. There might be a place in the city that sells newspapers. But a newspaper is a whole bunch of news printed in one location that you can buy and you can read. There's also something called a tabloid. So a newspaper will report on things that are happening in your country, in your city, in the world, etc., etc. A tabloid will mostly report on famous people and what they are doing in their lives or what they are doing for work. Okay, so a tabloid, we have a word in English called gossip. Gossip is like talking about people and saying what they're doing. A tabloid is kind of a printed form of gossip. Sometimes the stories are true. Sometimes the stories are exaggerated. And I think even sometimes the stories aren't true. But that's what a tabloid is. So a newspaper would be a reliable source of news. A tabloid would be lots of information about famous people, about celebrities that may or may not be true. Hopefully the tabloids don't get mad at me for saying that it might not be true. Journalist, columnist. So that's a hard word, isn't it? Columnist. So columnist. You do say columnist, but when I say it fast, it sounds different. Someone who writes for a newspaper. You might write for a magazine, a newspaper. I think you can even be a journalist and write for like an online news source as well. A journalist, though, is also a career. It's a job that you go to school for. So if you want to become a journalist, you go to school and you study journalism in order to learn how to write good news stories, in order to write good news articles. So the person who does it is called a journalist or a columnist. I think a columnist just writes articles every week, sometimes on the same topics. But that is what we would call them. So I mentioned this a few times. We have news articles or news stories. So if you were to say, hey, Bob, did you hear about the Edmonton Oilers? I just read a news article about them the other day. Or, hey, Bob, did you hear about the Edmonton Oilers? I just read a news story about them this morning. I'm sorry to hear that they lost. So anyways, we call that a news article or a news story. So a newspaper would have lots of articles. It would have lots of stories. And of course, you'll probably all be familiar with this one. We call these headlines. The title of the news article, the title of the news story is called a headline. It's usually larger print. Sometimes it's bold, large, bold print. And you see the headline first. And then if you are interested, you read the news story. So here we have a very old headline. The eagle has landed. I think it's been a number of years since people have walked on the moon. I do think, though, we're starting to go back. So we'll see how that goes. And then we have the front page. Okay, so if something makes the front page, if a news story is on the front page, it's probably the most important thing that's happening in that city or in the world or in that country. Okay, so the front page is where the most important news article goes. It's where you'll find the largest headlines on the front page. And it's where you'll find out about whatever important thing is happening at that moment in your area. And then the newspaper, of course, has sections. So I'll go through some of these fairly quickly. A newspaper, by the way, is made up of several sections usually. Sometimes if it's a small newspaper, there might only be one or two sections. But in a larger paper, there will be many. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but main sections would be the local, national, or world news section. This might all be one section, but this would be local news, things that are happening in your city or town. National news, which is news that's happening in your country. And then world news would be news that's happening in the world. So we actually get a small newspaper here, which only has local news. I can go to school and we get a newspaper that has national news, mostly about Canada. And it does have a section on the world. Or you might be reading about world news. There's a business section, which reports on things like the stock market and what's Tesla doing and what's Elon Musk's latest tweet, those kinds of things. So you'll have the business section. There's a sports section, which for some people is their most enjoyable section of the newspaper. They just love reading the sports section to see how their team is doing, their football team, their baseball team, their soccer team, their American football team, their cricket team. I'm not sure what sports you all watch, but you would go to this section. If you didn't already hear it on the news, you might go to the newspaper to find out. There's usually an entertainment section. Now, this might depend on what newspaper you buy. The entertainment section will tell you about the latest movies that are in the theater. It might even list the show times of when those movies are playing. It might report on who won the latest award at some big gala where a bunch of actors go in your country or in Hollywood or wherever. But the entertainment section would report on that. It would report on music. It would report on, it might have the top 10 list of best novels. It'll report on TV shows and those kinds of things. And then, of course, there's a weather section. The weather section tells you what the weather's going to be like. Sometimes the weather section in a newspaper, though, isn't the best place to go. For me, the internet is the better place to go if I want to find out what's happening, what the weather forecast is for that week. So here you see they're going to show you the 7-day forecast. They're telling you what the weather will be like or might be like for the next 7 days. Breaking news. Breaking news. I think we sometimes call this a news flash, but breaking news is probably more common. This is news that's happening right now. This can happen when you're watching TV. Maybe you're watching a TV show and then all of a sudden they just stop and they go to the newsroom and they start telling you about what's happening in the world. So breaking news is important news. This is usually on television, where they suddenly stop the regular program or the show and they start telling you about something that's happening in the world. News coverage is just a general term to talk about when they are telling you about what's happening somewhere, and then they're doing it daily. So during the pandemic, there was news coverage every day about how many people were in the hospital. During an election, there's usually news coverage for the entire time that people are voting that day. So they talk about what's happening and who's currently winning the election. So we would just simply refer to that as news coverage. This is something new-ish. In English, when we say ish, it kind of means like not really new, but relatively new. So like I'll talk about ish another time. But fake news is something that started about 10 or 15 years ago with the rise of social media. So sometimes when you read news online, it's actually not true. It's fake. It's a lie. Some news is true and some news is fake news. And sometimes it's hard to figure out which is which. 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was harder to have fake news because all of your news came from official news sources. But now anyone can write a news article. Like I can write a news article today and make a website that looks like a news source, and somebody might believe it. The press. So we do refer to usually newspapers as the press, but we can use television as well, and internet news. If you work for the government and you release news, you might be called the press secretary. So you're the person who tells the news of the government to the people, but it's just a general term for news. So the people who make the news, we would call them the press, even though not everyone is running a pressing machine or what do you call that a printing press. There you go. Not everyone is running a printing press. Can you tell I'm thinking about something else while I'm teaching the lesson? I shouldn't do that. And if you have freedom of the press, it means that the newspapers can print what they want without the government telling them what to do. So in the world, some countries have a lot of freedom of the press. Some have less freedom of the press. But that would simply mean that the government doesn't tell the newspaper or other news sources what to report on. An interview. I should have put this one earlier. An interview is when a news reporter talks to someone. So when they chopped down the speed camera in the town close to me, they interviewed a couple people. They interviewed the people who live there. They interviewed the mayor to see what was going to happen. So it basically means the news reporter, this is my microphone. If you're wondering why I'm doing this, the news reporter would ask questions and then they would interview someone, usually on the street or on location. And then if you listen to the radio, we usually call it a news broadcast. So a broadcast is anytime you listen to something, actually you can watch a broadcast as well. It's still from the days when everything went through antennas. So they would broadcast the news story, right? So when you're listening to the news on your radio, you're listening to a news broadcast. And then there's sometimes a news update. An update is simply more information about a news story that you might be following. So you might be following, today you might be reading updates about how the debate went last night between Biden and Trump. My kids watched a little bit of it. I'm actually not that interested in American politics, but you might be reading a news update this morning. More information about how the debate went or more information about what happened.